episode of Tate School of Fitness Corner Podcast. And on today's episode, we have a very special guest, Dr. Janaka Lewis. She is the director of the Center of the Study for the New South at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. She is also an author. She has written, well, for what I have researched so far, 3 books: Freedom Narratives of African American Women, and also Brown All Over, and Bo Nia Marie Passes the Test, and also co-authored a book as well. Dr. King is Tired Too, with Mac Bowman, MD. Welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
I'm well, and thank you for having me. Especially so close to Thanksgiving, so it's good to be in conversation.
Yes, it is. Absolutely. Excuse me for stammering over things early in this process. It's just so much you have accomplished in a very short period of time. I'm very fascinated by your journey. How did it start? When did you get into academia?
So I think I knew I wanted to be a professor as soon as I found out what a professor was, which really wasn't until I got to college. Like I knew people taught at college, but my first year, I was a first year student at Duke University, and I had a Black woman professor, Dr. Charlotte Pierce Baker, and the class was Designs for Black Women's Living. And we read Essence magazine, we read Audre Lorde, we read Sonia Sanchez, and I was just fascinated by the fact that there was this college class that was all about talking about Black women, and I knew that's what I wanted to do. And so I knew I wanted to teach. I have educators in my family, but it didn't occur to me to teach on a college level until I got to college. And then I knew, that was going to be my path, and just had to figure out, okay, get a PhD. How do you do that? Okay, this is what I want to study. And then, went on to do that. So that kind of lit the path, and here I am.
Yeah, it's amazing because I also have, I'm come from a family of educators, but they never, and they PhDs and everything, but they never talked about it, which was very shocking. Because when I actually entered college, I was like, oh, these are the steps that you have to actually pursue to earn your PhD. Because I had no idea, at all, at all. And being in that environment and coming across professors who look like us was life-changing.
Absolutely.
So that sparked more on my personal journey to become an avid reader and wanted to hear people's stories and seeing things in a whole new light. So that I really think college, I know it's a huge debate now, like should you go or should you not go? Is it worth it or not? And I know cost is ridiculous. It is. But I think those experiences on campus, I think college was more of a networking thing.
Absolutely. And that exposure to different experiences. And I mean, even going to Duke, being predominantly white institution, I had so many Black professors who were like, hey, what can I do to, help you and support you? And I mean, it just really felt like a supportive environment and community. I had a Black history professor, Dr. Raymond Gavins, and he supported me in doing research on institutions in Georgia, education and religious institutions. And so it really is that, exposure and growing that network.
Absolutely. It's so valuable to just becoming who you are, because college put us in situations to grow, especially when you go off to school, because you don't have that voice of your parents, even though you still communicate with them, but they're not there 24/7.
And you learn to advocate for, yourself, but also be part of a community on a greater level. So absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's valuable because you take that over into whatever field you go into. If you become an entrepreneur, if you work, you need those skills. You learn soft skills, you learn hard skills, you need those skills. So it's very, very important. I want to ask you, how long have you been a professor?
Oh, goodness. I've been at my current position and I'm associate professor of English too for 12 years, but then I taught at Spelman College for a year before that. And then at Northwestern as a graduate instructor for 3 years before that. So probably total of 16 or 17 years.
Wow.
Yeah,
Wow.
which is
Remarkable.
crazy.
Yeah, that's remarkable. It flies by, definitely.
Mhm.
Um, but of course you love it because you're still doing it, you know?
I do. And it's, I mean, just that opportunity, especially to mentor students who look like me, to be part of, those communities and just to teach what I love. Like I get to decide every semester, all right, what do I want to talk about with who,
Hmm.
So I teach English, I teach Africana studies, I teach women's and gender studies. And then in the spring, I'm doing a class about Black women writers who write about the South. And so just even being able to pull like, all right, I want to talk about, Alice Walker, The Color Purple. I want to talk about Jasmine Ward, who's one of my favorite, current authors, writes about, Mississippi and New Orleans. And so just thinking about what are the conversations I want to have and back to the point about exposure, what do I want to expose students to that might not be, what they see every
Hmm.
day, even though North Carolina is, Southern. Those who haven't been to Georgia, haven't been to Alabama, haven't been to Mississippi, what experiences do they need to read about to, kind of grow their understanding of the world too. So.
Absolutely. And I can only imagine being in that environment where you are surrounded with individuals who think of ideals all the
Mm-hmm,
time. You
mm-hmm,
know, that's such a stimulating environment to have, and then you create that space where they're allowed to do that. So that's amazing in itself, because I always feel like individuals who constantly think of new things and look at things from a different vantage point is there is something special that can happen when you get a
mm-hmm.
group of those individuals together.
Yeah,
Um,
and one thing that's been really cool is that we have a big network of Black women professors on campus. And so I had a research group of 4 or 5 Black women, and depending on the project, we work together on things. So we have one group that looks at what we're calling mother schooling, and it's, the experiences of Black mothers, especially supporting students during the pandemic, like how are they making sure their kids get what they need, what support do they need, and then another project we're looking at Black women's experiences, like health and social mobility wise, coming back from the pandemic. So it's been cool to be like, hey, talking with other Black women professors, like, all right, you're in sociology, you're looking at it from this perspective. I'm in literature. I'm looking at it from this perspective. You're in education, and then, we all come together and we also have a good time too. Like, just
mhm.
how can we figure things out together? And so that's been a nice part of the network too. Doing it in community, and never having to figure out things by myself.
Yeah, that has to be absolutely awesome, to lean in with your fellow sisters to get
Hmm.
things discussed. So that sounds so rewarding to do that. And speaking, you mentioned the pandemic. How did it affect how you actually was able to help your students last year?
Yeah. That's a great question. And even before the pandemic, I would always have students coming to me, especially, students who look like me and saying, like, this is the situation. Like, how can I, finish my education? I may be working, I might be a parent, I might be, doing all these things. And I'm like, all right, let's sit and figure it out, right? This is what you need to do for your classes, but you got to take care of your family. You have to take care of your home environment. And so, what can I do to help support you? And so that was some conversations that I've been having for years with students. And so then when it came to what everybody was experiencing, it's only the natural question for me, like, all right, how as faculty, can we support y'all's learning? And so there were definitely students who were needing more, or some who were, at home and trying to figure out space where they could do their work. And so, from my perspective, it was more about like what is needed so you can keep doing what you need to do. But then I saw, some of my colleagues like, well, they're not turning their video on and they're not doing this and they're not doing that. And I'm like, okay, well, do you know what they're trying to do? Like, do you know that? And I'm teaching at home with my kids learning in, the next room or in the same room. And so I'm like, if you think about what you're experiencing and then you multiply it, they're showing up. You might not see their faces, but they're showing up. So what can you do to actually help them continue their educational journey? So it definitely has been different, but I think it's just opened up more conversations about what's needed in general, for our students to be able to show up and still learn while they are, still living their lives. So, I mean, I'm like, we're not back to normal, still dealing with the same things, but how can access look different, as a result of what we've all experienced?
Absolutely. And that's so important because, again, like you said, I think people, of course, everyone's going through a lot. A lot was going on last year, but people was complaining about that, not just in the academic space, but in the workplace of why they're not turning the camera on, why they're not doing this, and doesn't matter, they're there. You had some people
they're showing up, make it valuable for them to be there, right? I had students who were, in the car driving from work, like, hey, I'm here. And I'm like, I'm glad you're here, don't look at the camera while you're driving. Like, but they wanted to be in space and they showed up however they could.
Exactly. And that's so important because I feel like that shows their dedication and their drive to get it done, because it was a lot going on and they still focus on, I need to get this education, I need to finish this class, because I'm actually in school working on another degree myself. And I remember when everything shut down, I was in class and they kicked us all out.
Wow.
So we didn't have any direction. The professor was highly upset. He was like, oh, yeah, I'm getting a text. They're telling me to send you all home. And we was like, what? He was like, you need to leave now. And it was just chaos trying to get off campus because you tell everyone to leave at the same time.
Yeah, and they're like, what?
Yeah. It was chaos. It was very chaotic. And from that point on, school just became very stressful because you didn't know anything. You didn't know what to tell people. You didn't know if you should just pass people, fail people, or what, So I can only imagine. I think because people were surviving, they just didn't think about that part of it. And, us who are in this space, we remember all this and we was trying to adjust and we was trying to make sure that we did the best that we could actually possibly do and come up with. And like you said, you also having children and they going through it as well with their online education. So how was that for you to be in that space and you actually a professor and you seeing how their teachers was actually helping them through this? How was that for you?
It was really good because, mostly we can't be in the classroom, all day. And I have a now third grader and sixth grader. So they were second and fifth grade last year. And I had relationships, with their teachers already to be able to say like a lot of parents, hey, I'm still working from home during the day. My husband's working from home during the day. What do I need to be able to do, to support them? And my second graders teacher said, well, we want them to be able to ask us still, even though we're not in the classroom, to ask us the questions, what they need. And I would hear her, online, on class and hear the ways that, her teacher was supporting her and asking questions and encouraging them to use the chat. And I know with the really small kids, it was hard because they can't just, type what they need, but, encouraging her to communicate and say, okay, speak up. You have a question, type in the chat. Like, can I, talk to you after this lesson or whatever? So it helped me to encourage them to advocate for themselves. But I also know that everybody wasn't able to do that in the same way. So I think it was a learning experience for all of us, but we're going to keep seeing the effects, especially, with the students, of what sunk in, what they didn't understand, what they understood, and, with test scores this year, because they went back to the beginning of grade tests. And so one, big concern is, how is the educational system going to fill in the gaps of what was lost? We can't just come back and be like, all right, we're back. So just being able to keep saying, like, all right, I know my kids are doing well, but like, what needs to be done overall for students to get what they need? So, and I know the teachers heard it all in people's houses, but also being able to hear them and how they communicate, and and kudos to all the educators, because a lot of them were doing it with their kids at home too. But it just really helped me to see what the classroom experience was like online, but also to be able to say, like, okay, what support is needed, coming back, but also moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's great points that you brought up, because I think also one of the things was access. A lot of individuals have access, appropriate internet speed, things like that. So what did they lose? What was really lost?
And in Charlotte, the system spent like $1 million on hotspots when the pandemic first hit. But then it was like, all right, well, how are the students going to be able to get the hotspots? Are they going to be, on buses? But they can't be on buses because, they're not vaccinated. They're not, this and that. And so there's a lot of questions where like, all right, this is how we should solve it. But it's like, oh, well, that's not going to work, because who's going to drive them to the bus to use the hotspots? Or who's going to, or even allowing the students to take the Chromebooks or the laptops home if they don't have the internet, like you just said? What are they doing? And so I think, there will continue to be questions there too. And speaking of power, let me just make sure my device is charged. 1 second.
Yeah. And that is so, that again, it's the effects are going to go it's going to be years and years of what we went through last year. Especially Black and brown individuals, because when it came to access, our community was affected the most. And again, you can't, if you already was working multiple jobs or working very long hours, whatever you was doing, and you couldn't get to, you was already struggling before this, how are you going to be able to actually manage having your kid at home and being educated through this? That's one of the, I feel for people, and this really, I think everything was kind of highlighted of our educational system and our health care system last year. A lot of weak spots in it. And if we're going to be a world that's moving forward with all this technology and all this stuff people talk about, you don't take care of the basics. Like, it should be high-speed internet everywhere. Personally, that it should be everywhere.
It should be everywhere, and not just, at certain times.
Exactly. It should be everywhere, because that's the only way that you're going to have people connected, and they're going to be able to actually keep up with everyone else. Because even though I think even people don't realize, even if you do have it, you still have to be able to learn how to use it. Use it for educational purposes, educate yourself, not just in the school system, but just learning, period. But it still need to be available. It still need to be there. It need to be in the infrastructure, period, for that to be done. Also, I want to kind of switch gears now and talk about you being an author and that process, and what was the first book that you actually wrote And what was that process like? Like, what made you say, I'm going to write a book?
Oh, there we go. So this is funny. I just had to move so I could plug up. But the first book I wrote was Brown All Over, and it's about a little boy who is discovering his color and that his, whole family is brown. And this is true story. My son was 2 years old, and he looked at me one day and said, "You are brown all over." And I guess they were learning colors in the preschool, and it's like, oh, red, what's red? Oh, orange, what's orange? What's brown? And it just like something clicked in his head, like, oh, mommy, you're brown, and I'm brown, and we're brown all over. And I said, that's a great title for a book. And so I sat there and I wrote the story like just one afternoon. And the story was that this little boy was trying to decide what to do with his colors, and he got to brown and was just like, what should I make brown? Should I draw chocolate? Should I draw this? Should I draw that? And he's like, oh, I got it. And he draws his family. And once I had the story outlined, I found a publisher and got it illustrated. But what was really exciting was the conversations after the book, because I would go and read to classes, and some, kids were just really excited, like, I'm brown. But what was so interesting was the kids who were not brown would say, well, is this book for me too? And I said, well, what do you use to draw yourself and draw your family? And even white kids don't say, I choose a white crayon or whatever, or the paper's white. Well, I choose peach, or I choose orange, or I choose, light brown, or I choose dark brown. And so then it got into conversations about what we look like and how we can be in a family and have 5 different colors, in the family, because people are different shades. And so I just wanted kids to be able to celebrate whatever color they are. Like, if you're brown, if you are peach, if you were orange, if you were, how did you get to be that color? Who else in your family is that color? And so I've still loved the conversations that I've had about the book, just to be able to say, and I used to say, nobody's favorite color is usually brown. Usually when I ask kids what their favorite color is, nobody says brown. But then after I read the book, and they can get excited about being brown and brown skin.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think during that stage of our lives, of course, you say we learn so much in those first 6 years, but during that stage of our lives, to actually learn and appreciate our shade is so powerful.
Yeah.
So the fact that you was able to illustrate that and demonstrate that for generations to come, because I'm brown all over, is so important to us as a people. People may not realize that, but as we get older and start learning more about ourselves, we learn everyone doesn't appreciate their skin tone. We just they don't. And to learn at a young age that it's okay and it's your skin tone, and to be proud of your skin tone, that is absolutely amazing. That's life-changing, I believe.
It is. And it's so funny. My son, he's 11 now, but he would then, tell people, he would say, well, I love being brown, and I'm sorry you're not brown because I love being brown. And one day we were at the swimming pool, and I can't remember what the conversation was, but he was telling an older gentleman, it was a white gentleman, I'm sorry you're not brown. Because being brown is just, just great. And the man said, well, we're all the same. And he was just like, no, because I'm brown and I love being brown. It was like, no, we're not all the same. Like, no, because I'm brown. And so, having that conversation has been great. I'm like, I want my children to be excited to be brown. And, he's like, I'm sorry, you're not me, because I'm out here brown. And, it's beautiful. So
Absolutely.
I love that.
Exactly. That is a great story. I love it. I love every last bit of it because, and I feel like something like that should be in schools, period. Like across that should be in schools.
Yes.
Because again, it's so important because when you constantly see images of your skin tone not in a positive light, you need enforcement. You need that positivity behind how you look, who looks like you, and what's behind. So I just think that's great. Now, from Brown All Over, what was your next?
So the next book was Bo Nia Marie Passes the Test. And so that's, well, actually, Bo Nia Marie and Freedom Narratives were the same year, 2017. And the story behind both of those, so Freedom Narratives of African American Women is my research book, is my book based on my dissertation. And it came from this question of what freedom looked like for Black women from the 19th century really to the present. And I started in the 19th century because, we think about the Emancipation Proclamation, which we know doesn't mean that Lincoln freed the slaves. But I came across this research that said that the first African-American men that were freed by legislation was those who were fighting, of course, on behalf of the Union, but then also their families. So Black women who were married to the soldiers also, gained their freedom legally, right? And so my question was then like, okay, well, what about those who weren't married? What about those who, weren't, attached to the specific, policies? How did they earn or think about their freedom? And so I looked at these different stories and narratives, including Lucy Craft Laney, which, brought me back to Augusta to do more archival research. And so I'm thinking about, Black women and freedom in that book. And at the same time, I, we have our second child, and she's getting a little older, and she was at that point 3 or 4, and she said, well, where's my book? She said, Justice got a book, because Brown All Over had a kid named Justin. And so that book, Bo Nia Marie Passes the Test, is about a little girl who is a scholar athlete. She plays softball, but she's not confident in test taking. And so, and that book is it's a rhyming book, but it's about a little girl who has to take a test, and she writes, and she studies, she writes her answers on her shoes. And then her mom washes her shoes, and she thinks she's not going to pass the test. And she realizes that by writing those answers on the shoes, she was actually practicing and studying, and, she passes the big test. And so I wrote that book. Actually, I used to be an academic coach for a college athletic program, and had, a student who used to write on her shoe as a learning mechanism. And so thinking about all the different ways we learn, but that, by coming up with your own strategies, you really can pass the test. It might not be, the same way as other people. And I always ask the students, well, why do we not, write and leave the answers, on our shoes? Because that's cheating. But but if you're writing on a piece of paper, that's note taking, right? So whatever your strategy looks like, so you pass that test. And also thinking about girls and STEM, and how people, say, girls aren't necessarily as competent in sciences and math, and just thinking like, oh, we just need to look at it a little bit differently. Like, how are we learning? How are we excited about math? She was thinking, the little girl in the book is thinking about the circumference of the ball, right? So, when we think about how we put math to work, also adding sports, also adding the support of her family and her teacher, like that's how we ensure success for our girls. And of course, it's a brown girl in the book. So I wanted to use that book to think about all of these different things, right? What support do we need to pass the big test? And how are we successful in that way too? And my little girl now loves math. She, like Hidden Figures, Katherine Johnson, all big influences for her. And I'm all about how do we change the story so that it's not about, what our deficit is, but like where our strength is instead.
Absolutely. And from that, then did you go into co-author the book with your father?
Yeah, so that book, so we're all storytellers, and my dad, he's in medicine, he's a cardiologist, but he was an English major. And so he would always, tell us these stories. And this particular story really stuck with me because I grew up knowing his mother, my paternal grandmother, until she passed away. And she, came from a sharecropping family in South Georgia, grew up, got married. My grandfather was in the military overseas, and she decided she was going to go to college. And she had two small children, my dad and my aunt. And she went to Albany, now Albany State University, but she went to Albany State College, and she was working as a waitress in a restaurant and raising my dad and my aunt and going to college. And so she used to like have my dad, he was 8 or 9, reading books for her under the table while she was working. And then he had to give a book report, and then she would write her paper and. But this story in particular was about when she walked them to see Dr. Martin Luther King when he came to Albany. And, part of the narrative is that Dr. King, found Albany one of the worst, most racist places he had ever been, and actually said, like, I'll just leave, like, because they were going to run him out of town. And he just said, I'll just leave. But my grandmother walked my dad and my aunt. She wouldn't let them ride the buses because she didn't want them riding segregated buses. So she said, we'll walk wherever we go. And so my dad would tell this story about being so tired because they walked so long to see Dr. King. And he just remembers like waiting and waiting at one of the local Baptist churches. And then when Dr. King got there, he was tired. And so my dad remembers feeling really let down because he had heard all these things about Dr. King, and he's this great man. And he's like, he walked in and he was tired, and I was tired because I had walked because we didn't have a car. And of course, after hearing the story a few times, I told my dad, I said, you have to write that down. Like, just write it down. Don't worry about it. Just write it down. And so he wrote it down on a piece of paper. And I, typed it up and sent it to him like, all right, is this what you wrote? And he was like, yes. And then I got one of my high school classmates who's an illustrator to illustrate it and to draw the images. And we had it for a couple years. I gave it to my dad, I think, for Christmas. And then I said, this needs to be published. And so I was republishing Brown All Over with a company called Bookbind Press. And he said, do you have any other projects? And I was like, no. And I was like, oh, well, I do have this other project. And I said, let me just send it to you and show me what it would look like. And they sent back the proofs. And I was like, this is done. We did some light editing, but we were able to publish that. And it was really powerful last year after, the murder of George Floyd, the murder of Ahmaud Arbery, which, we know today accountability has been held to say, what are the stories that still need to be told? And that was one of them that it was important to get out. So my dad jokes and says I made him write a book. And I was like, you were going to tell me that story one more time before, I was going to write it down myself. So I just wanted to make sure it was your words and your story and what you experienced. And so that was last year in 2020 that one was published.
Wow, that is absolutely amazing. Again, to have the gift to be able to put that together, get that out, and get it out to the world. That's very, very special. And the fact that you did it with your father, the last one, I mean, that's, it's all about family, I see, because you had a book for your son, a book for your daughter, and you did a book with your father. And that is really, really, that's awesome. I love it. I absolutely love it. So what's next for you?
That's a great question too. So I have been on research leave this semester, actually doing research on Black families and land. and how we own land, how we use land, how we use what we grow on land for wellness. And so we have some family land in Thompson that hasn't been in Thompson, Georgia, that hasn't really been used for much. We used to go fishing when we were, my grandmother was still alive, and she and my dad purchased this land just so so we would have it. And so I've realized, especially during COVID-19, so many people are creating their own paths and plans for wellness, whether it's, growing on a balcony, growing on the kitchen table, or using family land. And it's a whole movement. So I've been researching that, and it's not just going to be, research, but it's really this like living project about how we access what's grown on Black land. And so I have a student who is creating this database of Black owned land in the Southeast, and who is the contact, if it's something that's grown there, how do we access it, and just this kind of living database, but then also tying it to what are our stories about health and wellness in Black families as tied to the land. So that's what I'm working on now. And then also my maternal grandmother was a chef and caterer for years and started her own business when she was in her 60s, and she's now in her 80s. And of course, she's like, well, then, I don't need to tell my story. And I'm like, yes, you do. So working with her to do kind of stories behind the recipes. So it's held in the family, but also, so it's there. And she was in Athens, Georgia, working with the colleges, or working with, UGA at a time when, we weren't really allowed to be at UGA, and she was then catering at the country club, and when we weren't able to be at the country club. And so, just even thinking about what are these stories about African Americans and food and entrepreneurship. So working with her now on telling her story that she could care less if it's told, but I think it's just really important to you started a business, you created these things for a family, and you should be celebrated too. So family stories and Black families, land, and wellness are what I'm working on right now. And actually just finished a draft of a book on Black girlhood and activism. So that hopefully will be out next year, but just telling stories about how people like Angela Davis, Asada Shakur, Toni Morrison write about and look back on girlhood as where their freedom comes from.
Yeah, that's amazing. Out of all that you have accomplished and what you got, what brings you the most joy?
My family, because they are just every day is a new different day. And my husband Daryl is he teaches at UNC Charlotte too, and so we've known each other since college, and to be on this journey together, and the kids where it's just like, all right, what today? what are we doing today? My youngest daughter acts. She's an actor, and we were talking about what her stage name is going to be versus her full name, and my son is into like architecture and engineering. And so I just learn a lot from them, and it just lets there be no dull moments at all. Because you think you know something, and then it's like, well, actually, I'm like, all right, let me think of things a different way. So that brings me joy.
That's true. And I also, you mentioned that about the healthy ways that people are growing on their land, finding ways. What do you do for your health? What do you do for your mental health and your physical health?
Yes. Okay. So I walk a lot, and especially during the pandemic. So this was one thing I will also credit my daughter with, because she was then 7, and she'd be like, we need to play. Like, it's time to play. Like, just because we're home don't mean we not having recess. Like, come on. So we were outside, on the sidewalk in front of our house doing hopscotch, kickball, all kinds of things. But walking like with neighbors, and that's been one thing that's consistent. Like I wake up and I have to walk. And if I don't walk in the morning, and I got this from my dad, because he runs several miles every day just to, just for mental wellness. But I'm like that with walking, where I'm like, I have to walk. And that's been something good too. And like walking with other people for, social life, and, to be able to see people walk in different neighborhoods, walk in different paths. That's been my main thing.
That's awesome. Well, I want to thank you for joining us today. I think that I'm just amazed by all the work that you have accomplished and what you have coming up. And I think it is very important what you do, because a lot of people talk about it, but you are actually putting action behind the words of getting our stories out.
Yeah.
So but thank you very much for coming on here, and I wish you all the success in the world.
Thank you. And thank you for everything you're doing. I think it's just inspirational, just thinking about like fitness and education and wellness and community. And that's what's keeping us alive. So thank you for everything you're doing too.
Well, thank you very much. And I will be catching up with you.
That sounds great.